Welcome again. My name is Dr. Chad, and we will be discussing Module B, Environmental Issues, Legal Framework and Organizational Politics. Let's start by taking an overview of what the objectives are. We will be discussing the framework and the regulation in the industry, explain the concepts of industrial relationships and link to strategic human resources. We will be looking at the major changes that happened in Australia in relation to industrial relations. We will be also discussing the political and contentious nature of the relationship in terms of employment. Of course, we're going to be linking the industrial relations and its implications on strategic human resource management, which is the core component of our subject. So let us start by defining what industrial relations is. It is a set of rules and regulations that determine and set aside the laws of engagement between employees and its organizations and the government agencies as well. The three parties involved in industrial relations are governments, employees and their trade unions. There are significant changes that happened with acts. The Fair Work Act of 2009 replaced the Work Choice Act of 2005, and then following in 2012 there were certain amendments to the Fair Work Act that also sets certain additional regulations and adjusted certain issues in industrial relations. The relationship between human resource management and industrial relations has always been and will continue to be contentious and stressful as such, because there are different objectives between both. The industrial relations sets laws and regulations of how employees and trade unions need to be involved in relationships, while employees and organizations have a different set of objectives sometimes. Because industrial relations are set by government agencies, they are usually set outside the organization. They're usually not in sync with policies and procedures set within the organization by human resource managers. In general, industrial relations or human resource management policies is always pro-management and anti-unions, and this by itself sets the stage for some contentious relationships between both. Strategic human resource management tries to bridge that gap between the two contradictory outcomes in a way whereby they both follow the same intention or objectives of making employees achieve the organizational objectives using government industrial relations policies. So the intention of strategic human resource is to align business strategies with industrial relations objectives in a way whereby both work towards the same goal. In Module A, we've looked at different models. The main emphasis of those models is a understanding of the environment around us. Industrial relations is a situational factor that we as human resource managers need to understand and appreciate and incorporate into the organizational objectives. So responses to industrial relations issues need to be always on the table when we are designing policies and procedures. So the legal basis of employment regulatory framework in Australia acts as the initial backbone behind developing those strategies, and not being aware of them can not lead to a proper strategic human resource management practices and models as such. So industrial relations in Australia describes the framework and regulatory background behind the relationship between employees and their organizations. So industrial relations in Australia describes the terms and conditions and the relationship between the conditions of employment and the organizations in Australia. So this is adopted from the concept of bargaining framework, which is basically participants and agents representing the interests of employees to develop practices and processes that are easily understood, and also mechanisms or actions or instruments that determine the outcomes. So therefore, legislation becomes most important to set the framework and the architecture behind these types of relationships and agreements. There has been a significant shift in Australia between collective bargaining, whereby a collection of trade unions speak on behalf of employees, to individual and collective agreements on terms of conditions. and that is a significant shift. This is why the industrial relations framework became most important rather than collective bargaining agreements. The following diagram explains the framework behind the Australian industrial relations. At the top of it would be the legislation, which is the Fair, and then comes the Fair Work Act of 2009, and then we have the Fair Work Commission, and then we have the Ombudsman and the courts. So all of these are stages in terms of who reports back to the Fair Work Act. The Fair Work Act is a one-stop shop, which means that it assists employees and employers in the conditions and terms of employment. It sets fair practices, dismissal procedures, awards, pay, these conditions and terms that are sufficient enough to achieve a harmonious working environment for employees at the workplace. Now, these are a brief history of the legislation and how it started. For example, in 1904, there was a Commonwealth Conciliation and Arbitration established, and then industrial relations was established in each state. In 96, the Workplace Relations Act was set up. Between 96 and 2006, there was the industrial relations system that was established, or framework, up to the stage where in 2009, the Fair Work Act was set up. We touched on certain aspects of the Fair Work Act in the previous presentation, but for further details, please have a look at this table, which discusses what would be the main components of it. One of the guiding principles for the industrial relations or the Fair Work Act are the NES, which is National Employment Standards, which sets out the maximum working hours, annual leave, carers leave, personal leave, sick leaves, in addition to other aspects of what are the terms and conditions of employment. So we'll discuss unions at the moment. By definition, it's comprised of employees who speak on behalf of a group of employees about rates and pay and conditions of employment. There has been a decline in the number of employees joining unions at the moment. Approximately 18% of the 10 million employees in Australia are unionized. Higher proportion of those are in the public sector, mostly full-time employees rather than part-time employees. They are almost similar levels between men and women in terms of employees joining unions. Basically, there is a council for trade unions, Australian Council of Trade Unions, that also tries to organize the functions of trade unions in different industries. So under the Fair Work Act of 2009, industrial relations, by definition, allows for individuals or organizations to speak on behalf of employees. There is no restriction for that. So, which comes under the principle of freedom of association, which means that employees have the right to be represented by others, to be involved in an association, and also to speak legally on behalf of employees within that association. So conduct lawful activities on behalf, and that is acceptable. So let's discuss employee associations or unions as such. Let's move to discuss employer and employer associations. So not employee trade unions, but associations as such, relevant to employers. In the past, employer associations represented employers with industrial action or industrial negotiations. However, with enterprise bargaining agreements and negotiations, the emphasis on employer association decreased, and now it became more towards individualized enterprise bargainings. So therefore, employers are making or discussing their own negotiations with employees, and there is a requirement for an employer association has diminished. As we discussed before, freedom of association is there in the Fair Work Act, but employers try and limit employees entering into trade unions by certain different tactics, whereby they try and negotiate individualized agreements with their employees separately, and they try and do different sort of collective negotiations with their employees themselves rather than using associations. So employers now have changed the terms and conditions of employment themselves by introducing more flexible working arrangements, flexible pay, different types of systems of leave, So without the need to actually unionize and discuss things with the trade unions as such. In terms of the processes within the Australian framework, there is a collective bargaining and enterprise bargaining that we need to distinguish between. Collective bargaining refers to the discussions or negotiations that happen between employers and trade unions. Enterprise bargaining happens at the enterprise level, which is the workplace level, to set the conditions of employment that are most suitable to the enterprise in hand. So it's different from collective agreements between workers or employers and trade unions. As you're aware, there are certain industries which maybe employ less number of employees or have much less collective bargaining power or strength. So the system allows for multi-enterprise bargaining or multi-agreements to be set up from different industries to be lumped together, and then they can speak on behalf of those industries. So let us move to discuss the instruments of regulation for the federal government. The main objective of this industrial relations or act as such is to provide a harmonious relationship where conflict is minimized and to set the minimum standards of an acceptable working condition. So everyone is going to be in a condition whereby they are most efficiently able to perform their job without anyone taking advantage of someone else, neither the employer, nor the trade unions, nor the government, nor the employees. So a relationship that is harmonious with each other. This is assisted by the NES, which is national standards. That there are 10 standards, which we listed before in that table, that sets the conditions of employment, absences, sick leaves, annual leave, maximum working hours. And also, in addition to that, there are a set of modern awards that are listed. These modern awards set the conditions in the national system in addition to the standards set. In addition to that, also there is the enterprise bargaining agreements, which we discussed before, that is a negotiation at the employer level that sets the conditions of employment with employees as such. Now, there is an important test for the government, which is the better off test, boot test. That means any agreement or negotiations that happens at the enterprise level should not, as such, make employees worse off than what they are with the national awards test. So, and that is discussed on a case-by-case basis. So enterprise agreement usually is not immediately agreed upon unless it passes that boot test. So comparison between the agreement and the national standards. Whichever makes the employee better off, then they will go with it, as long as it doesn't make him worse off. So let's elaborate on what enterprise agreements are. And enterprise agreements set the conditions of employment as much as the Fair Work Act and the national standards, but they are done at the enterprise level, at the workplace level. These agreements, enterprise agreements, also determine rates of pay, how do we resolve conflict, deduction of wages, rights of employees, conditions of employment. So it sets up those types of regulations and conditions in the terms of employment between the employer and the employees at the enterprise level. I think what's most crucial or important for us to understand is unfair dismissal, which most of the contentious issues that happen in employment is about that, pay and dismissal. So unfair dismissal refers to employee being given the no longer needed for some unjust or unreasonable or unfair sort of issue that no one can justify. The dismissal, to be just, has to follow the business code, and it can be the dismissal will be deemed as unjust or unfair if it doesn't follow business code of practices, and also it's not a direct result of redundancy or the job no longer exists, or there is a termination or finishing of the contract itself. So, and that's where the government or the law or the Fair Work Act sets the rules and standards behind what is considered as fair and just dismissal. In order for us to understand a bit more about unfair dismissal, have a look at the state workplace relations system, which sets out some instructions or discussion about what is considered to be unfair and how dismissal need to be done, the processes behind it. the presence of someone else, a mediator, and given notice about when is this going to happen, enough notice to be given to the employee, and also in terms of the reasons behind dismissal, and employee need to be given enough notice or chances to improve performance if it's a performance-based dismissal. There are certain sets of regulations that assist in workplace relations and conditions. For example, state law sets out the compensation conditions, leave conditions, surveillance of employee conditions, and these are set by the state sort of set of legal procedures. Other instances such as anti-discrimination and privacy are set by state law. Commonwealth law goes a bit higher and sets equality and discrimination law in terms of gender equality and gender inequality, and that's a little bit designed by Commonwealth government, in addition to health and safety issues. Implications of whatever we have been discussing about the Fair Work Act is at the micro and macro level. So at the micro level, the emphasis is the conditions or the fairness to the employees in the workplace relationships. So shifting the power towards a more harmonious conditions of employment from a collective agreement or a trade union discussion with employees as such. Having discussed all of this, let's have a look at how does this affect HR and HR functions or implications for human resource managers. The first implication is about the way human resource managers do agreements or agreement making. The basic principle behind industrial relations and the Fair Work Trade Act is to make agreements in good faith with both parties' interests in mind. The second implication is, I think human resource managers in the past, they had containment strategies, conflict with trade unions. At the moment, the more there is a harmonious relationships with trade unions, the better the outcome is for both employees and human resource or the organization as such. So moving towards a more solid harmonious relationship is better than containment and unfavoring such relationships. With this, the emphasis becomes more on direct relationship with employees, whereby employees can request for and challenge a decision. They can rely on certain standards for them to be able to apply the better off test in these standards. So the necessity or the importance of direct relationships between human resource managers and employees is emphasized with these new changes in industrial relations and fair work trade practices. Another implication is to customize organizational policies and practices in a way using the Act and its standards to bridge that gap, the inequality gap. At the moment, it's about 17% gap between males and females in Australia, and the Fair Work Trade Act tries to bridge that gap. So human resource managers' role is to try and implement such policies at the enterprise bargaining level or at the conditions of employment level to be able to bridge such issues. HR managers also have an issue with compliance because there are certain requirements from the government to be complying with the national standards and the Act itself in setting up the conditions of employment and in setting up the requirements of what's expected from an employee within their contract negotiation terms. Having discussed industrial relations and Fair Work Act and the standards and employment conditions, it has implications not only on human resource functions but on the strategic models of human resources, because these all act as pressures and issues or influences that affect the development of such strategies in human resources. In Australia, as we have seen, there has been a significant change from collective bargaining and coercion into a collective understanding and harmonious relationships and negotiations at the enterprise level, and that in a way that meets the requirements of the companies and the enterprises and the employees, rather than one national set of standards that doesn't sort of deal with the conditions of employment relevant to the industry. The system now favors negotiations between employers and employees and between government and workers or employers, they set minimum standards, and they have the boot or the better off test as in mind in terms of negotiations. This is important because it's away from setting standards and everyone need to follow to a more negotiation and coordination between all parties within the strategic human resource model. This puts more emphasis on being vigilant in terms of being aware of rules and regulations and legislation around human resource managers, rather than just set up the standards on conditions to the best interest of the workplace, rather than best interest of employee and government and workplace at the same time. So there is a need to be aware of everything that happens around in setting up those policies and procedures. Thank you for listening to this module. This brings us to the end of it, and if you need any further help, please email the link below, and we'll see you next time discussing Module C. Thank you very much.